A few years ago, something happened in the tech world that sent shockwaves through developers, open source contributors, and the entire Linux community. Microsoft, a company that once called Linux a cancer, made a massive move that surprised nearly everyone. In 2018, Microsoft officially acquired GitHub for $7.5 billion. At first glance, it looked like just another tech acquisition. But for millions of developers around the world, this deal raised an important question. What does this mean for the future of open source? And more importantly, is Linux finally going mainstream? To understand the real impact of Microsoft buying GitHub, we first need to understand what GitHub actually represents. GitHub is not just a website where programmers upload code. It is the central hub of modern software development. It hosts millions of projects, including operating systems, programming tools, AI models, games, and entire ecosystems of open source software. The majority of Linux-related development lives on GitHub, from small utilities to huge projects like desktop environments, container tools, and development frameworks. GitHub has become the digital home for open source collaboration. For many developers, GitHub is the place where innovation happens first. A new idea appears in a repository. Developers contribute improvements, bugs get fixed, and eventually that project becomes part of something much bigger. Linux itself may not be fully hosted there, but a huge part of the Linux ecosystem depends on GitHub in some way. That means when Microsoft bought GitHub, it was not just buying a code hosting platform. It was buying influence over the world's largest open source developer community. The reaction from developers was immediate and emotional. Some people were excited, believing Microsoft had changed and now truly supported open source. Others were extremely skeptical. After all, this was the same company that spent decades fighting against open source software. Many developers feared Microsoft might slowly take control of the platform, change policies, introduce restrictions, or push proprietary tools into the open source ecosystem. Within hours of the announcement, many developers began migrating their projects to alternative platforms. Services like GitLab and self-hosted repositories saw a surge in new users. The open source community has always valued independence, and the idea of a massive corporation controlling the most important development platform made people uncomfortable. But something interesting happened over time. Instead of destroying GitHub or locking it down, Microsoft invested heavily in improving it. The company added new features, expanded infrastructure, improved security tools, and integrated powerful developer services. GitHub became faster, more reliably, and more capable than ever before. One of the biggest changes came with the introduction of GitHub Actions, a powerful automation system that allows developers to automatically build, test, and deploy software. This turned GitHub from a simple code hosting site into a full development platform. Developers could now manage entire software pipelines directly inside GitHub without relying on external tools. Another major development was the rise of GitHub Copilot, an AI coding assistant powered by large language models. Copilot helps developers write code faster by suggesting functions, generating code snippets, and even explaining complex logic. While some developers worry about AI replacing programmers, many see it as a productivity tool that accelerates development. These improvements help GitHub remain the dominant platform for open source development. Instead of losing users, the platform continued to grow rapidly. Millions of new developers joined, new projects were created every day, and the ecosystem expanded further. But how does this relate to Linux going mainstream? To answer that question, we need to look at how the relationship between Microsoft and Linux has evolved over the last decade. In the early 2000s, Microsoft saw Linux as a threat. The company built its business around Windows and proprietary software, and open source represented a completely different philosophy. Linux encouraged collaboration, transparency, and community-driven development. However, the technology's landscape began to change. Cloud computing emerged as the new frontier of software infrastructure. Companies no longer relied solely on desktop operating systems. Instead, they built massive data centers, running thousands of servers. And in that environment, Linux quickly became the dominant operating system. Most cloud platforms today run primarily on Linux. Whether it is web hosting, AI workloads, container infrastructure, or enterprise backend systems, Linux powers the majority of servers on the internet. Companies realized Linux offered stability, performance, flexibility, and zero licensing cost. Microsoft could not ignore this reality. If the company wanted to remain competitive in cloud computing, it had to embrace Linux rather than fight it. This led to a dramatic shift in Microsoft's strategy. Microsoft began contributing to open source projects. The company started releasing its own tools as open source software. It built a Linux subsystem directly into Windows called Windows Subsystem for Linux, allowing developers to run Linux tools natively inside Windows. Microsoft even became one of the largest contributors to the Linux kernel itself. The acquisition of GitHub was part of this larger transformation. Instead of trying to control developers through proprietary platforms, Microsoft positioned itself as a partner to the open source community. The company realized that supporting developers ultimately strengthens its cloud business, particularly its Azure platform. Today, Azure runs massive amounts of Linux workloads. In fact, a significant portion of Azure virtual machines are Linux. Microsoft actively promotes Linux distributions on its cloud platform, including Ubuntu, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, SUSE Linux Enterprise, and many others. This shift shows how Linux has quietly become a central pillar of modern computing. It powers servers, supercomputers, cloud platforms, embedded devices, smartphones, and even space technology. The Linux kernel runs on billions of devices worldwide. However, the desktop world remains one of the few areas where Linux has struggled to reach mainstream adoption. Most desktop users still rely on Windows or Mac, but even here, the landscape is slowly changing. Gaming on Linux has improved dramatically thanks to compatibility layers and platform support. Professional development tools now work seamlessly across Linux environments. User-friendly distributions make installation and daily usage easier than ever before. Many users who once relied on Windows are now exploring Linux alternatives. GitHub plays an important role in this transformation because it accelerates collaboration across the entire ecosystem. Developers building Linux applications can easily share code, track issues, collaborate with contributors, and distribute software globally. Open-source desktop environments, package managers, drivers, and applications are constantly evolving through GitHub-based development. This rapid collaboration allows Linux distributions to improve faster than ever before. Another important factor is the rise of developer culture. Today, more people are learning programming than at any time in history. Students, hobbyists, engineers, and entrepreneurs are all building software projects. Many of them start their journey on GitHub. When developers become comfortable with Linux tools during development, they often adopt Linux as their daily operating system. This creates a natural pipeline where programming culture drives Linux adoption. Microsoft understands this dynamic very well. By owning GitHub, the company positions itself at the center of developer activity. Whether developers use Linux, Windows, or Mac OS, many of them collaborate on Git. But rather than forcing developers into a specific operating system, Microsoft focuses on providing services that work everywhere. Tools like Visual Studio Code run perfectly on Linux. The .NET development platform now supports Linux natively. Microsoft even maintains Linux versions of many development tools. This cross-platform strategy reduces friction between ecosystems. Developers can build software on Linux while still using Microsoft tools and cloud services. Instead of competing directly with Linux, Microsoft integrates with it. For the Linux community, this situation is both positive and complicated. On one hand, Microsoft's support accelerates open source development and brings powerful infrastructure to developers. On the other hand, some community members worry about long-term influence and corporate control. Open source has always thrived on independence. The strength of Linux lies in its decentralized nature. No single company owns Linux. Thousands of contributors from around the world collaborate to improve it. Even if Microsoft owns GitHub, it does not control Linux development itself. The Linux kernel is maintained through independent governance structures. Projects can move to other hosting platforms if necessary. Developers still maintain the freedom to fork code, create alternatives, and build independent communities. In many ways, this balance is what keeps the open source ecosystem healthy. Companies provide resources, funding, and infrastructure, while the community maintains control over the core technologies. Another interesting aspect of GitHub's influence is the growth of open collaboration beyond software. Today, GitHub hosts documentation, educational materials, hardware designs, scientific research, and even government transparency projects. The platform has become a universal collaboration hub. This broader adoption increases awareness of open source principles. More people learn how collaborative development works. More organizations adopt open source strategies. This cultural shift indirectly benefits Linux because Linux represents one of the most successful open source projects ever created. As open source thinking spreads across industries, Linux becomes the natural foundation for many new technologies. Artificial intelligence platforms often rely on Linux-based infrastructure. Container technologies like Docker and Kubernetes are deeply tied to Linux features. Edge computing devices frequently run Linux distributions. All of this growth reinforces Linux as the backbone of modern computing. So, is Linux going mainstream? The answer depends on how we define mainstream. If mainstream means dominating desktop computers, Linux still has work to do. But if mainstream means powering the majority of global technology infrastructure, Linux is already there. Most people interact with Linux every day without realizing it. When they stream a video, use a search engine, run cloud-based software, or interact with smart devices, Linux is often working behind the scenes. Microsoft's acquisition of GitHub did not stop this trend. In fact, it may have accelerated it by strengthening the tools developers use to build Linux-based software. The real impact of the acquisition is not control over open source, but integration between ecosystems. The boundaries between proprietary and open source software are becoming more flexible. Companies collaborate with communities while still building commercial products. This hybrid model allows innovation to move faster. Open source projects benefit from corporate investment while companies benefit from community-driven creativity. Of course, the future will always involve debate about control, freedom, and the direction of technology. The open source community remains vigilant about protecting the values that made Linux successful. Developers continue building alternative platforms, decentralized hosting systems, and independent infrastructure. If GitHub ever moves in a direction that harms open source collaboration, the community has the power to migrate elsewhere. That possibility alone keeps the ecosystem balanced. Ultimately, the story of Microsoft buying GitHub is not about one company taking over open source. It is about the moment when open source became too important to ignore. Microsoft realized that the future of computing depends on collaboration rather than isolation. Linux proved that global communities can build world-changing technology together. By embracing open source instead of fighting it, Microsoft acknowledged a new reality in the technology world. The era of closed ecosystems dominating everything is fading. Instead, we are entering a period where open collaboration drives innovation across industries, and Linux stands at the center of that transformation. Whether on servers, cloud platforms, development environments, AI research labs, or experimental hardware, Linux continues expanding into new territory, and with platforms like GitHub enabling millions of developers to collaborate instantly across the planet, the momentum behind Linux has never been stronger. The mainstream future of Linux may not look like everyone replacing Windows tomorrow, but it will look like a world where Linux quietly powers more of the technology around us every single year. And in that sense, the Linux revolution is not something that might happen someday. It is already happening right now.